All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 30, Section 3, The Rise of Fascism. So like we mentioned earlier, this chapter 30 or 29, depending on what edition of the textbook you have, is really centered on World War II. And in discussing the causes of World War II, we usually say that there are two major causes to it. The first is what we talked about last section, and that is the Great Depression. Of course, a global economic depression that led people and nations to look for more extreme responses to solve the economic crisis. So, for example, those nations that were capitalistic and democratic, right? So the United States, Great Britain, France. The Great Depression had caused a lot of people to question as to whether or not this sort of system of government could properly solve the problem. A lot of people gave up on capitalism and democracy. There was an alternative in the Soviet Union, and that was communism. And at least from the outside, it looked like communism was working. The Soviet Union transformed itself from an agrarian nation into an industrial nation. But on the inside, it was very violent. There was a lot of death and misery. But from the outside, it looked like a possible solution to the problem. Soviet Union was not really affected by the Great Depression like the other nations were. But then there was potentially a third way, and that was fascism. And fascism is this alternative to capitalism. It's an alternative to democracy, and it's alternative to communism. And it's a more extreme solution that finds a lot of popularity in the aftermath of, and in the midst of the Great Depression. The second cause that we might say is the post-World War I, we'll just say world, and in that there is a couple of things. We might say, one, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the post-war settlements, specifically with the Paris Peace Conference. So, you have, especially in the country of Germany, but not limited to it, a country that is looking for revenge. So maybe we might say post-World War I, we might say a lot of people are not, we'll just say not satisfied with it, and a reluctance by some to use force. Right, a reluctance to use force. Maybe a willingness to use force on the one hand and a reluctance to use force on the other. One of these nations was Italy, and despite the fact that we most commonly associate fascism with Germany, it was actually invented in Italy. Italy was definitely one of the nations that was very much not satisfied after World War I. Italy was a nation that at first was allied with Germany in the First World War, but then switched sides to the Allies. They were promised things by the Allied powers, but really never got it. And so Italy quite literally left the Paris Peace Conference, which was the peace conference to settle World War I, empty-handed. And this was difficult, left the Paris Peace Conference empty-handed. Really didn't get much. And, this left a lot of the Italian population asking their government, well, why? Why did so many Italians fight in World War I? Number one, it wasn't necessary. And number two, they really didn't get anything from it. You add in the post-World War I sort of radicalism, the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution, which gives sort of a fear of a Red Scare across Europe and the United States, plus the economic downturn. And you have people in Italy and other places looking for change. So, for example, in Italy, the quote-unquote fighting men or fighting units, these were former World War I vets turned sort of paramilitary, we might describe them. These were soldiers coming back from the war, still very well armed, looking for a change in Italy. One of them was Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini was the founder of fascism as an ideology. Now, fascism is a little bit difficult to define, but if we had to sort of briefly define it, of course, Benito Mussolini established the Fascist Party. If we wanted to define fascism, we would say it's a doctrine or an ideology that puts forward the supremacy of the nation, right? So it is a sort of hyper-nationalism of the nation, right? In this case, that would mean Italy first, right? Italy above all. And that would be different than something like communism, which again is something that focuses more on class. It pits the rich against the poor. It's the cause for the poor. Like Karl Marx said in the manifesto, workers of the world unite. So it has nothing to do with any particular country. Capitalism and democracy is much more about individual rights, right? You have the right to kind of do whatever you want with your money in a capitalist economy. You have the right to vote in a democratic institution. In fascism, it's all about what's best for Italy. So there's no such thing as individual rights, individuality. You are simply part of this greater thing, this nation, so to speak. With the Italian government in a very shaky position, with a very angry population, Benito Mussolini marched on Rome. The March on Rome is the takeover of the Italian government, which he did in 1922, and immediately did what every good authoritarian dictator does, and that was to ban political parties, take over both the press and education to further support Mussolini. Used new technologies, right? This is something that fascists were actually quite innovative at, and that was using new mediums of technology to gain popular support. So we might say of movies and radios, again, these were new technologies. And the same thing was true in places like Germany. You know, Adolf Hitler also used movies and radio, and the Nazis used them to great effect. So new technologies used to capture public support, we'll say. Right, used to capture public support. And Mussolini also adopted the title Il Duce, which means the leader. And so by the mid-1920s, Mussolini had effectively banned every single other political opposition, taken over the radio, the airwaves, the newspapers, taken over education, and began building a fascist regime that put Italy first and foremost. So Mussolini is the founder/inventor of fascism, but perhaps fascism and the fascist ideology is probably most well known in the case of Germany. Germany had a very similar circumstance to Italy in some ways. Number one, Germany was certainly not satisfied with the Paris Peace Conference, especially things like reparations. And it was also, in this case, experiencing a unique economic downturn in the form of hyperinflation in 1923. So hyperinflation was due to war reparations. Recall, Germany lost reparations or reparations? I think it's reparations. Yeah, reparations. Recall that Germany lost World War I and was forced to pay back all of the money owed to Britain and France for the damages done by World War I. Because of that, Germany was forced to pay war reparations, which meant that in order to do so, they printed money. And when you print money, it devalues the currency. And so in Germany in 1923, a lot of people had their entire savings wiped out, and this led to, again, a lot of uncertainty and anxiety about the economic situation. On top of that, the Treaty of Versailles also blamed Germany for World War I. This was something that a lot of Germans wanted revenge for. Again, a very sort of spiteful German population, believing that, number one, they had never really lost the war to begin with, but number two, that the Treaty of Versailles was not a legitimate peace treaty, that Germany had not accepted it. And so this gave rise, of course, to Adolf Hitler, who took a page out of Mussolini's book, established the Nazi Party, which was the fascist party in Germany. After a brief failed effort to try and take over the government in the 1920s, Adolf Hitler was put in jail. It was there that he wrote Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, and this was more or less the outline for how Hitler would create a we might say maybe a future, at the time, future German state. I think, I don't know the exact date, but I want to say maybe he wrote this book in 1925, so this was well before, the Second World War. And in Mein Kampf, in sort of outlining what a future fascist German state would be, he touched upon themes such as nationalism, invoking the idea that all German-speaking peoples need to be part of this, Germany, and that Germans were the master race. So we might say that this is, sort of the extreme version of nationalism. And again, this point was to create a Germany that would be home for everybody who spoke German, which at the time, of course, German-speaking people lived in various different countries. He said that he would overturn the Treaty of Versailles. So let's say wanted to, I don't know if overturn is the right word, but certainly to defy every single order that the treaty created, and to create what he called Lebensraum, which was quote-unquote living space. That was to create living space for German people. And again, these were very much in racialized terms as to who was German. One was German if they were German-speaking, but they were also German if they were ethnically German, if they were Anglo, as opposed to, and I forget the exact term that the textbook uses, but, Mediterranean, like French or Italian or Eastern European or Slavic, specifically Anglo in terms of the racial focus on it. And this living space where Germans were supposed to live, it was going to be in Eastern Europe. The idea was to displace the Eastern European population, who Hitler and other Nazis saw as racially inferior, and allow for places like Poland and Russia to be the home for German-speaking people. When the Nazi Party, or when Hitler came out of prison after writing Mein Kampf, he transformed the Nazi Party into a mainstream political party, so much so that by 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor and given by the German legislature dictatorial powers. So by 1933, Hitler is chancellor with full control. Essentially, the Nazis called for a state of emergency, and during that state of emergency, they gave Hitler complete power, and after that, he simply just never gave it back. And once being granted full totalitarian control of the German state, Hitler did what every good dictator does, what Mussolini did before him, and that was to eliminate any sort of threat or competition to his power, which included the banning of political parties. It meant assuming the title of Führer, which meant leader, and claiming to establish a Third Reich, which meant a third empire, a third German empire, and specifically, the first one being the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was a medieval state that existed from approximately, I don't know, what was it, like, like maybe like the year 600 to the year 1800. The German Empire that existed right on the beginning of World War I, 1871, the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War, all the way to 1918, Germany's defeat in World War I, where the German Empire was broken up. And then, of course, the Third Reich was supposed to be what Hitler called the Thousand-Year Reich, the Third German Empire. Amongst the policies of the Nazis was anti-Semitism, and that was to strip German Jews of their citizenship. These are sometimes also referred to as the Nuremberg Laws. And in 1935, just 2 years after Hitler came to power, the Nazis said that anybody of Jewish heritage, of Jewish ancestry, is not a German citizen. There were also discriminatory laws that were placed against the Jews. The banning of things like marriage between Jews and Germans, the banning of Jews in certain public areas. This was something that was in many cases recognized as one of the steps towards eventually the final solution, which was the Holocaust, and that was the mass murder of the European Jewish population. It was also to identify Jews, to require them to wear the Star of David in Nazi Germany. And again, one thing to point out was that Judaism, or determining if one was a Jew, this was also done in strictly racial terms, in terms of ancestry, not religious, but in terms of ancestry. At the same time, Germany did move towards an economic recovery, and when it came to Nazi popular support, a lot of people in Germany supported Hitler and his policies, especially before World War II, due to the economic recovery. Again, whereas other previous systems like capitalism and democracy had failed, fascism in Italy, fascism in Germany seemed to be doing the trick, at least for the time being. However, though, it was the attempted, pushback against the Treaty of Versailles. It was the countries of Germany, Italy, and Japan aggressively attacking their neighbors that caused World War II. Right? When you think about fascism and the point of only Germany or only Italy being the important factor there, well, then it doesn't really give any hesitation to not attacking your neighbors. If the ideology says do what's best for Germans, then it makes sense to go ahead and attack your neighbors. Same thing is true of Italy. In Japan, it was a little bit different. It was a little bit less about ideology, but it was the Japanese military just more or less, attacking people and conquering, territories for resources under the guise of economic, nationalism or economic protectionism. So piece by piece, once Hitler came into power, he began to challenge the Treaty of Versailles and dismantle it. Whereas the treaty prohibited Germany from building up an army and having an air force, Hitler did both things. The German military began to rebuild. The German air force was established. The Allied powers did nothing. Italy, meanwhile, attacked Ethiopia. Ethiopia is Eastern Africa. And again, for the most part, the outside powers, namely Britain, France, and the United States, were reluctant to do anything about it, right? Reluctant to use force against this aggressive military behavior. The League of Nations, recall, the League of Nations, this was an international organization to keep peace. This was created in the aftermath of World War I. The idea was that World War I was so terrible that this international organization needed to be created so that countries could avoid going to war and they could settle their disputes peacefully. This was created in a very optimistic time period. By the early 1930s, it's clear that the League of Nations is failing at every step. First of all, the United States, President Woodrow Wilson, who had created the League of Nations, or whose idea it was, the United States never joined it. Germany, which was once a member, left the League of Nations. Japan, once a member, left the League of Nations. Italy, I don't recall if Italy was actually part of the League, but it proved ineffective. It failed to stop the German military buildup. It failed to stop Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, and ultimately it failed to stop German expansion, which led German expansion to World War II. First, it included annexing Austria. Austria was an ally of Germany in World War I. Austria was specifically prohibited and forbidden from joining Germany. In 1938, it became part of Germany. In Czechoslovakia, Hitler demanded the German-speaking sections of Czechoslovakia be added. Again, Hitler's plan was to create a Germany for all German-speaking people. So the people who spoke Germany in Czechoslovakia, Hitler demanded that that territory be added to Europe. Britain and France met with Hitler at the Munich Conference. So the Munich Conference was a meeting with France and Britain, with Germany. And at that meeting, France and Britain agreed to give Hitler the parts of Czechoslovakia, right? So at this conference, we'll just say the Allies, we mean Britain and France, agreed to give away Czech land to Hitler. All right, agreed to give away Czech land to Hitler. This policy was known as appeasement. Appeasement is to give in to the demands. In this case, it's become it's become known for giving into the demands of dictators specifically, but it could just be to give into the demands of anyone, dictators, right? So for example, if you're, if your kid is crying because they don't have ice cream and you just appease them by I'll just give you ice cream so you shut up. That's essentially what France and Britain did. And there were a number of reasons as to why. One was that these countries, France and Britain, wanted to avoid war. Number two, there was a fear of communism, right? Also boiling up, especially in the Soviet Union. As for as bad as Hitler was, at least he wasn't a communist. And so, Neville Chamberlain, who famously said, there's peace in our time. Neville Chamberlain was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. So we'll say PM of Great Britain. When he said there was peace in our time, this was, of course, on the verge of the deadliest conflict ever. So history has not, really treated Neville Chamberlain very well. It is, seen in hindsight, definitely, that both France and Britain were, way too maybe optimistic or didn't quite have the resolve to sort of stand up to Hitler and his demands. And by giving in or appeasing him only led Hitler to make more and more and more demands, which he eventually did. Ultimately, even though Hitler demanded only the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia, he eventually took over all of it. And it was once Hitler broke the agreement at the Munich conference that Britain and France recognized that nothing short of war would be required to really stop German expansion. So France and Britain will say after Munich, new war was needed. But again, we're sort of biding their time and waiting for the right opportunity. Meanwhile, German expansion then focused on Poland, which of course also had a large German-speaking population. So just like annexing Austria, just like annexing Czechoslovakia, Poland was simply only the next on the list. And of course, in all of these things, in defying Versailles and building up the military, in annexing Austria and annexing Czechoslovakia, nobody had stopped Germany before. So what's to think that anyone's going to stop Germany now? In fact, the only nation that the Germans really feared was the Soviet Union. And in 1939, the Nazis and the Soviets made an agreement to divide Poland. The Soviet Union would take half of Poland, the Nazis would take the other half, mostly the German-speaking half. And in September 1st, 1939, with reassurance from the Soviet Union that they wouldn't attack, Germany invaded Poland. So this is September 1st. 1939, and this is considered to be the start of World War II. And that was because at that moment, both Britain and France declared war on Germany.